One of the biggest objections I see to AI today is that the over-reliance of AI is going to decrease our ability to problem solve, just like the way that we did before the large language model. Generative AI is very much helping us to do menial tasks, and a lot of us are using it in everyday circumstances. People are using it for jobs, using it to generate images, to help them with their social media, etc., etc. I want to ask the question whether this is a problem. Specifically, is it a problem that the over-reliance on AI is going to degrade our ability to think critically? And I want to see whether or not this is true and what that actually means for society. My name is Stephen Jenkins. I'm a data scientist and I'm passionate about the impact that AI and technology is having and is going to have on friendships and relationships. So, is AI making us dumber? Well, a recent study examining the effect of ChatGPT on participants suggests that might be the case. The paper called Your Brain on ChatGPT, they suggest in their conclusion that ChatGPT is having an effect on our ability to learn. What the researchers did is that they used EEG to scan the brain to infer the way and the cognitive abilities of different participants using different tools. Specifically, what the researchers did is they split the participants up into 3 different groups. The first group, they were allowed to use ChatGPT. The second group were only allowed to use Google, so they weren't allowed to use ChatGPT. They could use their own, obviously, cognition, but they were also allowed to use Google to search for things for their task. And then the final group were not allowed to use ChatGPT or Google. What they found was that those that were using ChatGPT to do certain tasks were not using as much of their brain function as the ones that were using no tools or even using Google. Now, interestingly, there were other effects that they found from this research. So, for example, there wasn't really a connection between the work that the participants were doing when they were using ChatGPT compared to those who were either using their cognition or Google. So what they found was that those who were using ChatGPT often had an inability to recall what they had done. So one of the tasks that they were doing was writing an essay. When the researchers asked the participants what it was that they had written and whether what they had written was of value to them, they didn't seem to be able to recall it very well, and there didn't seem to be a connection, something that suggested that what they had written was of value. Now, interestingly, the conclusion to this was that going forward, using ChatGPT is something that we need to be careful with as members of the public. So they were suggesting that this is a significant issue and that over time, this could potentially increase. The research seemed to suggest that the uncritical use of LLMs created this sort of cognitive debt. That is where participants found short-term gain, but in the long term, they weren't able to embed that of which they had learned. A good analogy for this is a muscle. So as somebody is trying to train for a marathon or whatever it is that they're wanting to do, they've got to continually train, they've got to continually build that muscle up. Similarly with our cognition, we've got to continually use our cognition for it to build and continue to be useful for us. If we offload our cognition to an LLM, it is likely to degrade over time. The reliance on AI is a form of cognitive offloading, which is defined as the process of using physical actions to aid in the processing of information for a given task. This cognitive offloading is something that I, for one, completely understand. I struggle with information processing. It's part of my dyslexia and specific learning disabilities. I often am very tempted to use AI in any situation that I have to think critically, especially in pressured situations. However, there is a danger with doing this, and I, for one, am trying not to do this all the time. In the study, AI Tools in Society, Impacts on Cognitive Offloading and the Future of Critical Thinking, the authors suggest that AI tools has a negative impact on critical thinking. Specifically, they found that AI tool use was a strong predictor of critical thinking, and that cognitive offloading was a strong mediator between AI and critical thinking. Now, there is a concern by the authors that the continued use of AI creates this sort of feedback loop. And you can imagine it makes complete sense. As we continue to use AI for critical thinking, we then find ourselves continuing to struggle when new problems arise. We are losing our ability to think critically. Now, as we lose our ability to think critically, we then feel like we need to use AI even more because those problems become bigger and feel more pressurized. And it creates this cycle whereby we're always having to use AI, and that over-reliance creates more problems than it solves, or at least potentially, depending on the situation that you're in. In particular, the studies showed that younger participants who rely on ChatGPT showed lower critical thinking scores compared to their older peers in the research. There's obviously a concern here that the continued AI use is going to degrade our critical thinking. And as that continues, there may be situations where AI is not available to us for whatever reason. We could use an example of where we see this in other industries. For example, airline pilots, they are trained to use aircrafts despite having so much technology behind them that allows the aircraft to essentially run on its own. It can run mostly automatically, but the human needs to be in the loop. They need to be there so that if anything goes wrong, they can step in. Now, the problem is that if the human is degraded in their critical thinking, they aren't experienced because they don't, or very rarely, need to do anything, then the problem occurs that these systems go down. The human is then unable to know what to do, and it creates a safety concern for those who are on the aircraft. The way that the airline industry deals with this is that they have certain aspects of the flight that is given over to the humans such that they can get a sense that they have some control over the flight. This might be something that we need to do in the AI world, in society, and potentially in other industries. And it's something that we really need to consider as we're moving forward, as we're adopting these tools. We've seen a rhetoric of fear and misunderstanding around technological advancements many, many times in the past. It's nothing new. This is just another technology that has been introduced in society by which we can complain and judge many people about. Of course, for example, the calculator, prior to its use, there were many highly skilled and sought after human calculators. And that created a sense of fear and mistrust, thinking that we are going to lose jobs, etc., etc. The introduction of the calculator completely changed the world. Today, we don't even think twice whether to use a calculator or not. The printing press, similar story. Scribes and illustrators, they thought they would just lose their jobs and there would be complete decrease in the sense of literature. Except many, many more people were able to develop their own skills in literature. It really had a positive impact on society. So as we can see, technology and tool use is definitely something that can bring about good within society, as long as the humans that are using them are intending to use them for good. And we've seen how people can be so innovative and use technology in such interesting ways to bring about positive impact on society. You may have heard the term hallucination in the context of chatbots. A colleague of mine and we once witnessed a large language model having a full-on existential crisis to the question, can you tell me the time? Albeit that was a smaller language model. However, I'm sure we can all attest to these very sophisticated large language models making very, very basic errors. I see on LinkedIn all the time various variants of the question of how many R's are in strawberry, where it gets it completely wrong. LLMs are just not very good at counting at its core. In the recent paper by OpenAI, Why Large Language Models Hallucinate, the researchers go into why it is that these very sophisticated systems at their core create these hallucinations. And they describe the fact that even if the training data, which is the data that is used to develop these large language models, even if that data was error-free, it would still cause these very, very basic errors within their outputs. So how did the researchers show that LLMs at their core are prone to such errors? Well, firstly, they went through a number of examples. So one of the examples they give is they put in a prompt, can you tell me Adam Tauman Kalai's birthday? I hope I've not butchered the pronunciation. And they also, in the prompt, they say, can you give me in the format of DDMMYYY? And if you don't know, don't tell me. Of course, what happens is the LLM comes back and it gives a date, and the date is not correct. They've tested this across many of the biggest chatbots, including ChatGPT 4.1, I believe, DeepSeek's advanced models, including Llama and I believe Claude as well. They've tested this on many of the largest language and advanced language models that are out there. Going back to the how many R's are in strawberry question, we've all come across this sort of rhetoric where it's like the large language models, they can't even do this simple task. Well, what they do, the researchers, is they show that these very basic tasks that we can do so intuitively are actually very, very difficult for these large language models. You can almost think of a large language model as a brain. And you can consider the data that is being used to train these large language models as the ocean. Now, if you imagine each droplet being a piece of training data, so these droplets are being fed into the large language model. Now, as this happens, you can imagine the information that's being fed. There are certain pieces of data that are going to produce interesting patterns. So for example, let's say we're learning language. So I say, hi, how are you? What is it that you're likely to respond with? Well, you're likely to respond with, I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Now, this is a pattern that you would see very, very often in discourse all across the internet and all across different places whereby they would have used data to train the model. However, prior to the training of these large language models, how many times have people asked how many R's are in strawberry and given a response? Very, very little, if none at all. And what you find is that these large language models are learning patterns. In the question, how many R's are in strawberry, there is a pattern here whereby the construct of that sentence is looking for, there's a task, it's looking for an answer, and it understands that there is an element of counting such that a number is a good thing to respond with. That's the sort of pattern that it seems to have learned. So it will respond with a number. But which number? Well, that's kind of unknown, I guess. Not really something I want to delve into today, but you can imagine if these large language models are somewhat a brain and they are pattern matching, so they are trying to find patterns in the data, then they will find some sort of pattern within numbers that have been answered for that sort of question. I'm really dumbing this down a little bit here, but I'm just trying to help you get an idea of how these things work and how these things will produce errors. And they aren't really things that we should automatically trust. Of course, that is assuming that all the data is correct. The information that is in the ocean could be incorrect in and of itself, and therefore the LLM that's being trained is going to learn poor or invalid facts about the world. So you've got two problems here. One problem is if you don't see the patterns and if it can't understand certain patterns, it's just going to make up anything that it thinks is correct based on the patterns that it has learnt. And the second problem is that the things that it does actually learn, the patterns that it is finding, may not be correct because we're training this on very, very large corpuses of data, of which are from sources that we can't validate in their entirety. So if you think that's bad, it kind of gets a bit worse. So once these large language models have been what we call pre-trained, so that's where we've kind of taken the ocean and stuck it within an LLM, there's a post-training process. Now, this post-training process is what we call reinforcement learning with human feedback. Now, I don't have time to go into that today, but essentially that process is used to realign the output of large language models to be more in line with human values. This process is very effective for making sure that the output of the large language model is kind and doesn't spit out anything that could be harmful towards humans. Now, during this process, there is also a problem when it comes to hallucinations, because the way that these large language models are post-trained is that they are using metrics by which the output should always be correct. Which is ironic because there are two obvious other options. One is that the output is invalid, and the other option is that the output is unknown. Now, the metrics that are being used is almost like a multiple choice test. For example, when we have taken multiple choice tests, if we didn't know the answer, it was always better to guess than to say, I don't know. And that's how these large language models are trained in post-training. They are given these metrics which says, you need to just get this answer correct, and you're not going to get any marks to say, I don't know. So you might as well try and guess the answer. So in our example before, where we were asking somebody's birthday, the answer is usually going to be either correct, because it's something that the large language model has seen multiple times in the ocean of data, or they're going to guess, because it is better to guess than to not know. And the researchers, they talk about how in order to prevent hallucinations, what they need to do is they need to change the metric system that they use in this post-training process. And that takes a lot of time, and it would have to take a completely new framework for post-training these models. If AI is so fallible, why is it that we trust them so much? Well, there's a number of reasons, at least I think anyway. One of the reasons is because of psychophancy, which is basically the use of flattery language to keep users using the system. So you may have used many chatbots, and sometimes you'll put in a statement or a question or whatever it is, and it will respond with, hey, that was a great question, or great insight, or whatever it is. The responses often give you a sense of satisfaction. It's positive feedback. The responses are unjudgmental, and this often gives the users an ego boost and is very, very much a way in which chatbots can continue to lure in people despite the fact that it might not be producing very good content. So it's good to note that despite the content itself being poor, the use of flattery language makes it seem like the responses are particularly interesting. We talked about this earlier. In post-training, often the process of alignment, this reinforcement learning with human feedback, this aligns the output of large language models to be in tune with users' values. Now, this implicitly creates and elicits a sense of trust between the user and the large language model. It's worth noting as a side note that these chatbots are increasingly being used as companions for those who are suffering from loneliness. And I think it speaks volumes to our society today. Human interaction seems to be less valuable than interactions with chatbots, and is something I think we need to be very aware of as we're utilizing large language models for everyday use. There are other contributing factors as well. One of these is certainly that big tech companies are wanting us to use it, putting out massive advertising campaigns, and every man and his dog should use it for everything that they do in their entire lives. But I think the biggest reason that we are drawn towards these large language models is found in the book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Now, the authors talk about two systems of thinking. System 1 type thinking is a fast response to a task or a given scenario, whereby we respond very quickly and it's almost like the first thing that comes to our mind. System 2 type thinking is very critical, methodical. It's the type of problem solving that we've been talking about throughout this whole video. I think, as they talk about in the book, that we are biased towards type 1 thinking. We have found a tool that will allow us to offload our critical thinking. Given that we use so much energy to think critically, to reflect, we often will try and find any means, even if we don't think about it consciously, to offload that critical thinking. And I think that large language models are yet just another tool that has allowed us to offload that critical thinking. In light of this, we must recognize that a lot of these behaviors have been developed over many, many years throughout our evolution and how we've developed as humans. Now, that doesn't mean that we today need to be biased towards type 1 thinking. I think we can overcome this bias and that we can start to reflect more so on the types of problems that come our way, and instead of automatically wanting to offload our critical thinking, we can use these systems to help us develop our critical thinking. And this is something that I think we can do if we can just pause and reflect on what we do in everyday life. So, what is it that intelligence actually gives us? Well, there are, of course, many, many examples. Understanding the contents of a book, writing and playing music, portrait painting, just any form of art. Intelligence is something that is extremely important to us. I have to use it on a daily basis when I'm programming, despite the aid of AI. But in the context of relationships, what is it that intelligence gives us? Because ultimately, I believe that relationships is the way in which humans mostly flourish. And I think there's a really great example of this. I don't know if many of you have seen the show DIY SOS, but the premise is that Nick Knowles and his team will come in and help a struggling family that is unable to do up their house. Now, what's really interesting and very soul satisfying about this show is that the team and the directors of the show, they engage with the local community. So the whole community, friends, family, teachers, different tradesmen, all from the area will come and help and transform a home for a really struggling family. This process very much involves critical thinking. And it's very relational. And the way in which it's relational is that the team themselves, they have to understand the family's needs. Are they disabled? How are the family going to interact with the house such that they can provide the best way that they can live within it? There are various safety concerns that they all have to consider, and they have to be implemented. And all of this has to be done in quite a short amount of time. This amount of critical thinking is crucial such that the family are able to enjoy their home going forward. And it's beyond contractual relationships, as they're doing this in a way that is essentially very loving. There are so many different ways in which critical thinking helps in the aid of relationships. I mean, just think about how many times I'm sure your parents has helped with a difficult maths question, or a friend has helped with a difficult maths question. You need to communicate the question or how you're struggling with the question to your friend or to your parents so that they can best help you with that question. This is a very relational interaction. And critical thinking is crucial in order to solve that goal. But relationships are all about putting the other first, that the other would be an end. And critical thinking being a means to that end, I believe that you have to do things with excellence. And ultimately, critical thinking is crucial so that we can do things in excellence for others. It must be said that AI is not solely the issue here. We can use AI to help us to improve relationships. Large language models, their bread and butter is language, of course. So it's very much a tool that we can use to help better understand each other through communication and better understand ourselves. But of course, we must be very, very careful in the use of AI. As we've been saying throughout this video, the uncritical use of AI is particularly dangerous. And this is where we can find AI being incredibly useful for us and an incredibly great tool use. When we are interacting with these chatbots, the output that it produces, we need to be very critical in the way that we process that information. Is it valid? What is it saying? Is it just using flashy language? We need to be making sure that as it tells us information, that we actually think about what is it that the chatbot is saying. And of course, if we do that, then our critical thinking is being used as we validate these large language models. In addition to this, if we critically analyze these AIs, it will also improve the AIs. Now, of course, some of you may think that that's a bad thing, and that may ultimately be a bad thing. But at the same time, if we are always continually criticizing and treating these chatbots as fallible, then even as they get better, our critical thinking can improve, can get better. So in light of all these things that we discussed, AI is just not a substitute for critical thinking, and we should never be treating it in that manner. AI can be used as an aid for relationships, and I think there are multiple ways that that can happen. However, a chatbot is never going to be better than a human, yourself, helping somebody, being relational, understanding the emotional, cognitive, the spiritual needs of another human being. And that's because you are context aware. You understand the world. You're experiencing the world. These chatbots aren't understanding the world. They are not connected to the world. So as we are interacting with these chatbots, we need to understand that they are not operating in the way that we operate. And the relational aspect that we have with one another, these chatbots will never have that. They will never provide that for us. AI will never be better than AI plus critical evaluation. Never. And we need to remember this in the recognition of how we do life. I believe this world is screaming out for true, meaningful relationships. A true friend, someone who cares, someone who loves, someone you can trust. And critical thinking is key, is absolutely key for building and maintaining true friendships. And AI is, of course, as we discussed, a potential dehibitation towards that. As we are thinking about the way in which we interact with other humans and AI, we must consider how it is that we can better build relationships. We can better understand other people, we can better love them, care for them, and build friendships that will last forever. And I believe that if we use AI carefully, methodically, and with a critical eye, we can help other people, we can help ourselves to better understand each other so that we can build relationships and build a better society.